But 100 years ago, you could have had more of a kind of a dogmatic stance. Now, we can talk about dogmatism in either way, right? So, you brought up being biblical or not being biblical, right? And so immediately then that brings to mind the idea of dogmatism. And, okay, this theology says X, so this is what I tenaciously hold, right? And that it's the religious person who then is the dogmatist. The one unreasonably, with blind faith, holding on to a statement. Willy-nilly, who cares about the evidence? Who cares about reasoning? Right? Well, and that's true. That's definitely a worry, regarding religious faith. But how many of you have heard, what is it called? There's some website, The Amazing Atheist. Right? Have you ever seen that website? Yeah. So many things like that, the so-called new atheism and materialism. Equally, extremely dogmatic, extremely emotional, not at all willing to have a rational, reasonable, fair-minded, open-minded discussion, but very tenaciously holding on to their beliefs. Now, you've seen the same sort of thing. We'll get to that. The last paper was on, political philosophy, right? But the same thing regarding other kinds of materialists in the political realm, communists, right? So you all hear on and on about the religious wars of religious people holding tenaciously to their faith, whatever that faith is, and leading to all kinds of wars and injustice, right? Now, what's very peculiar is that typically in a state institution and in popular culture, what's not brought out is, hey, wait a minute, what about the well over 100 million people, citizens of their own countries who were murdered by their atheistic communist countries? Pol Pot, which probably, we talked about that earlier, didn't we? And before then, it's probably practically nobody even has any clue what he did in the killing fields, right? Or he murdered almost 2 million of his own people right after the Vietnam War when we pulled out, right? Or Stalin, or Lenin, or Mao Zedong. I mean, even now, Mao is very popular with many American youth, as is Che Guevara from Cuba. But you look into the history of those people, they're sociopaths. They were gruesome, violent murderers over their own citizens about so much as their taste in music. I kind of have to chuckle when I see somebody like a Carlos Santana wearing a Che t-shirt. The black and red one's really cool. At least they used to be 10, 15 years ago. Okay, Che literally would have put a bullet in his head during his lunch break, which he often did, into Santana's head because of that style of music, which he thought was degradation to the great communist revolution, because it made people act more emotional and wild and not a good condition for good citizens of the communist revolution. It needs to have a lot of self-control, right? So, we can have extreme dogmatism and fanaticism not at all open to rational discussion, whether it be from a religious mindset or an atheistic mindset, whether it be capitalists being that way, closed off to other views, or whether it be communists or socialists who are extremely dogmatic in their very entrenched beliefs, even though they don't really even understand the history of their own beliefs or the alternative viewpoints. It's fanaticism. And that can be religious or non-religious, doesn't matter. But anyway, it's a dangerous mindset and certainly not a good approach for doing philosophy. Okay, is there a difference then between not just the body and the mind, but also between the mind and consciousness? So I guess we've talked enough about that, and you guys had that very reasonable assumption that you're not saying that consciousness or the mind or the spirit is identical to the body. But in saying that, you weren't giving away your thesis and thus not having to prove anything, because it still could be the case that the mind is fully dependent on the body, even though they're not identical. And that you still would have to set out to prove, right? So, good job. Okay, group 2. Never use another as a means only, but always as an end. So that would be Kant, Immanuel Kant, because you're talking about egoism versus altruism, right?
Yeah.
So it can be that you have examples where someone does benefit from another, right? And in those cases, it could be that they form that relationship with the other only in order to receive that benefit. In which case, they are using the other only as a means to their benefit, right? And so that then would be pure egoism, right? But we got to be careful that we don't assume that just because somebody is using another as a means, that they're not also using them or seeing them, treating them as an end in themselves. Right? So if you treat somebody as an end in themselves, meaning you respect them, that doesn't mean like you like everything about them. I don't mean that. But in the sense that you understand that they are a person, and as a person, equal to you in rights and dignity and worth. That means you see the other as an end in themselves, never to be used as a means only. That's not to say, though, that you don't use others and they don't use you. So it could be that you're using another, but yet you do respect them as an end in themselves. Does that make sense? So just because you find an example of somebody using another as a means, benefiting from them, isn't necessarily to show that you're acting as an egoist, not also seeing them as an end in themselves. Does that make sense? All right, so benefiting from another doesn't necessarily prove egoism. There's something called the hedonic paradox. That is that typically people who do use others only as a means, not an end in themselves, who do act strictly egoistically, end up as the less happy people. Whereas people who don't treat others only as a means to their end, as an egoist, typically end up as the happier people. So you can imagine that. Anybody give some example you can think of where that would...
You can't please everyone. Like if you're a people pleaser, you're going to spend all your time trying to make others happy when you don't focus on yourself.
Yeah, that would be, and that's an excellent example from the other side. Like, wait a minute, what about the altruism, right? What about with altruism where you're always worried about pleasing others and not seeing yourself as one who has rights and who has worth? And then you become just a doormat, right? So you almost end up thinking something like this. Everybody else has worth except me, right? And so, yeah, that would be a great example of how altruism could go bad. Yes?
So So what you're saying about the opposite of altruism is that if you're using people as a means to an end and you're only...
Oh, if you're using them as a means only.
Right.
Yeah,
so
to your end.
So if that's what you're doing and that's what, the reason you're going to be unhappy is because you're not building any successful, meaningful relationships. You're an empty person.
Right.
That's why you're not happy.
Yeah. Yeah, you're just using somebody else. And often people get that sense then too, right? So that'd be a great example as to why it could well be that if you're just looking out for you, well, you might think, hey, look, if you're looking out for you, well, good, then you're going to do good things for you, right? Well, actually, if you're only looking out for you, probably other people are going to discern that that's what you're doing, which means probably you're not going to have a close, long-lasting relationship with that person. Basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah, so you're not going to have any support system.
Yeah, and then there goes your support system, and so there goes your happiness. So Aristotle says, we're social creatures. Pretty easy to show, right? That we need each other in a whole lot of ways. I mean, in diversifying our abilities so that we all produce different things, so that we don't all have to be everything. I don't have to be a carpenter and a plumber and a tax accountant and yada, yada, yada. I mean, who could be all those things and be any good at any of it, right? But when we're able to diversify and then benefit from others, we're happier. Okay, but what's going to undermine that kind of a relationship is if others feel valued only for what they can do, not respected as a person, well, then you're going to disintegrate societal bonds. You're going to have a less happy society. You yourself will be less happy. A hedonic paradox. Anybody else have any?
Ethical, and rational egoism, and I give examples for each.
Yes.
Okay.
So like for an example, egoism. You seek out your pleasure. That's all that matters. Okay, but if you follow that philosophy, paradoxically, there's lots of ways that works badly for you, right? Whereas, like people often give the trite advice. If you're unhappy, what should you do? Quit focusing on yourself and your problems and go help somebody. You know what I mean? And so often that advice that might sound trite, that you hear a lot, hopefully, really does make a lot of sense. Because if you get all completely centered on yourself, there's probably no one less happy than a narcissist, right? But if instead you think, hey, rather than obsessing about how somebody hasn't been just to me, or about what I want, or about how my needs aren't being met, what if I take the focus off of me, and put the focus on somebody else? Here's somebody else that's really hurting, obviously. That I could give some attention to them, focus on them, and in taking your mind off yourself and on to the needs of another, you yourself probably will be in a happier state. You know what I mean? So that's the hedonic paradox. Okay, the other problem that typically we have with egoism is that it is irrefutable. So we've mentioned this before. If you have a theory that can't possibly be refuted, where you're not able to show the conditions under which, if they obtain, the theory will have been shown to be false. If you can't do that, if you can't state that, then you don't have a theory at all, you have a dogma. Right? So we'll want to ask that of egoism. These are just classic arguments I'm giving you here from the other side, right? So if you put that toward egoism and you say, okay, your theory is, either that the right thing for me to do, the thing that I should do is whatever is to my benefit, or similarly, your theory could be psychological egoism, that it so happens that whatever anybody does always is to their own benefit. that's their motivation. Just as a matter of psychology, everybody seeks their own benefit. That's psychological egoism. Ethical egoism says what you should do, the moral thing for you to do, is whatever is to your benefit. So, slight difference there. Anyway, with either version of egoism like that, can you state the conditions under which, if they're true, you will say your theory has been falsified? Well, you might think that, okay, tell you what. If you give me a case where somebody says, oh, this is my platoon, and we look out for each other, and I committed that I would, and I care about them, and there is a grenade that has been thrown in the tent, so I immediately am going to jump on that grenade and either be badly wounded for the rest of my life or killed. Okay, if you can show me an example like that, well, then yeah, you've refuted my theory. Okay, but no, that's not what the egoist says. Because no matter what you bring up, because there are lots of examples of exactly that, right? And so whatever you bring up, they're never going to accept that it is a refutation of their theory. Okay, then again, you're acting as a dogmatist, not as a philosopher. Does that make sense? Alrighty, so then we went on to group number 3. I respect that you are for X, but I am personally against it. So typically that kind of a line is used just as a cop-out. Typically what that actually means is, I think that what you are supporting is immoral, but I don't want to lock horns with you because I'm afraid to and I don't like confrontation. So I'm going to say, okay, I respect your view to hold that, but personally I disagree. For myself, though, right? So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that you actually are a subjectivist. Meaning, I understand why you believe what you do regarding morality, but I believe something different. And I believe that we both can be right. So that's subjectivism. Same thing as relativism, but not relative to a culture, but relative to an individual. So if you have that kind of individualist relativism, which is subjectivism, that means you're saying that two contradictory statements, both actually are true. So when X says, somebody give me some moral issue. That I can use. Okay, so when X says birth control is immoral, right? And let's say we're talking about birth control in the sense of, drugs, right? How about that, okay? No, I mean the pill, okay? Right? So I mean, let's not talk about like natural family planning or something like that, right? So is that fair? All right, so somebody says, I believe that it is immoral to use the pill. And somebody else says, no, I think it is moral to use the pill. Okay, do we have an example here of P and not P? Are both statements saying opposite things? Yes, they are. All right, so how can it be that they're both true? Well, it could be that they're both true if we're talking about just taste. I happen to prefer the taste of vanilla ice cream. You happen to prefer the taste of chocolate ice cream, right? Okay, we're just talking about taste. We don't argue about that. That's perfectly fine. Oh, well, then you're a subjectivist, you're a relativist. No, because we're not stating that it's a moral claim. We're stating that it's simply a matter of taste. It is a purely subjective stance. Does that make sense? Okay, but in this, is that what we're doing here regarding the use of the pill? Well, probably you're thinking, no, there is something substantive here, and if one of us is right, it means the other of us is wrong, right? So the one person is going to say, okay, here are my reasons for why I think my thesis is true, right? And so what are they going to say, likely? Well, there's too many people in the world, so if we have birth control, we're going to not keep increasing our population to the point where we can't, where it's not sustainable, right? Does that make sense? Okay, and then the other person's going to argue back, no, that's not a good argument because, you see, actually we can take everybody in the whole world right now and fit them all on an island with a little house, right? So it's not that it would be unsustainable. Yes?
Side note, it actually is unsustainable because our population is expected to double in 61 years and our max for resources is 15 billion.
Right.
So in 61 years, if y'all don't stop having children.
Yeah, and that argument just goes back and forth, right? So that, and then somebody's going to respond back to that, right? And say, well, yeah, but do you realize that kind of what's built into existence is, like we just said about communism, which killed over 100 million of their own people within each nation, and so wars always happen, right? And the Black Death, which wiped out about half of Europe, right? So that's not taking that kind of thing into account, right? Or, in other words, aren't we arguing about something? Right? So we're having this back and forth argument, right? Well, okay, if you're having this back and forth argument about it, it's probably not like it's either chocolate or vanilla ice cream that we happen to prefer, right? It's no, there's a fact of the matter here. Now maybe I'm right, maybe you're right, maybe we're both somewhat wrong, but it's not the case that I can say something and for me it's true and you can say something and for you it's true, when it's clearly not just a matter of taste, which clearly we can go on having this argument about, right? Because then somebody else is going to say, okay, no, the pill is immoral. So why is the pill moral? Well, because of population control. Okay, why is the pill immoral? Well, it causes cancer. Is the pill a carcinogen? Now, this is why I like that you all have your computers open in my classroom, because you can just instantly check this right now. What's that? Yeah, it is. The pill is a carcinogen. Carcinogen. Causes cancer. Okay, is it the case that, especially in California, that through women using the pill, that it's gotten into their water supply, such that the testosterone level of men now, compared to about 50 years ago, I forget the exact statistic, but something like, okay, let me say 100 years ago to be safer, cut in half. That the sperm count in men now, compared to, let me just say 100 years ago to be safe, I think it's cut more than in half. Yes, Aaron.
Wait, so you're saying how do they get into the water supply?
Because women use it, and then women use the toilets, and so it gets into the water supply. Okay. Yeah, it's especially notable in, if you look at something like LA, a big city in California. So, is it the case that the pill is, affecting women's health and affecting, whether it's for better or worse, but definitely affecting everybody through the water supply, right? Yeah.
Do you think that's the reason men care? Because it's affecting their own
Well, yeah, maybe men think hey, you're cutting our testosterone in half, and we don't like that.
It affects them. Oh, never mind.
But maybe men don't like that because that cuts their testosterone level. And so then they're worried about their health, not women's health, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but then again, Okay, so in arguing about this, though, is it not the case that we're having a substantive argument? An argument in which there is a fact of the matter about it. We're not just talking anymore about, you like chocolate ice cream, I like vanilla ice cream. Yeah, who cares? You got your way, I got my way, whatever. No, it's pretty easy. The more we're going to have this conversation from different sides, the more of you are going to start really caring. Right? As though we're talking about something where there really is a truth or a falsity about it, and we better get it straight. Because it matters. You know what I'm saying? All right, so if subjectivism or relativism relative to the individual, if that's true, that means that one can say, one should use the pill, and another can say, one should not use the pill. And there actually is no fact of the matter about it. There is no truth about it. You know what I'm saying? So that's a serious problem with relativism. All right, where's my cursor to see where I left off at? Okay, relativism gives us a way to discuss differences rationally and to find common ground. Okay, and that is totally understandable why you would think that. Number one, it's what your state education and your popular culture has indoctrinated into you. But let me try to deprogram you, okay? I can talk this inflammatory-like because I can back it up very easily. What if you and I agree that we have differences of opinion on something that really matters, but that I have one set of standards for deciding right and wrong, and you have a different set of standards for what's right and wrong, and there's no overlap between your standards and my standards? Does that sound like a good way to adjudicate our disagreement?
No.
No, right. There's no hope. There's absolutely no hope. It's basically like I speak one language, you speak another language, and we don't have a translator. We don't have the little thing you can put in your ear where it hears what the other person says and translates to you right away. We don't have that either. No translation. We've got no way to communicate. Okay, that's where cultural relativism puts us. Whereas absolutism says, okay, there is a standard. And because that standard has something to do with reason, and you have a mind and I have a mind, we can talk back and forth and help each other find the common ground. Help us sort out in our troubled relationship where maybe I thought I was right, but I'm kind of wrong in this area. And okay, you thought that you were right, but here's why really you weren't right. Okay, but if you don't have some hope of a common ground, some absolute from which you both agree as an authority, there's no hope to work out your problems. That make sense? Okay, relative to the individual, or to the state, or to the culture. What are we going to say it's relative to? So we talk about cultural relativism. Well, that sounds like then we're going to say it's relative to the culture. But I mean, in this very room, do we not have different cultures? Right? So that's hard to see how that's going to work. Or if it's relative to the individual, well, then we have radical subjectivism. We've already seen the problem with that. Or what are we going to say? It's relative to the state, which has its geographic borders. Meaning just because you crossed the line of a border, now all of a sudden one thing that was morally anathema becomes morally praiseworthy. Is that how morality works if you cross over a line? Okay, further, what about the examples you could easily use? That means if a state says that it's right, it means that it's right. Okay, so when the former, atheistic communism, USSR, Stalin said that what we should do is take all the food from, the Ukrainians, to give to our troops just before winter. And then, how many of them was it that died from that? Nobody knows, I'm sure. That's kind of weird, because I believe it was somewhere like over 1 million people died from that one act. And you never taught that. Gosh, that's strange. Because you are taught about the Spanish Inquisition, are you not? How many people for about 400 years were killed every year, given the Spanish Inquisition? Forgetting exactly what it was, but I believe the number was 4. But everybody knows about that. Wonder why. Well, anyway, when the USSR took away the produce just before winter, somewhere around 1 million or so people died. That would mean that if the state says that it's right, well then it's right, because whatever the state does is right. Really? So we can come up with all kinds of examples like that, right? Of course, the Nazis are a regular standby. The Nazis say that we should kill 6 million Jews, so that's what they should do, because the state said so. So whatever the state says is right, right? Or we can say here with Jim Crow laws. So the state says that African Americans should sit in the back of the bus, should use separate bathrooms, right? Shouldn't be able to vote, or at least have their vote not worth as much. Well, that's good. That's what we should do, because whatever the state says is right is right. So when you look at lots of examples like this, you can see how, at least at this intuitive level, cultural relativism is really hard to swallow. And when it comes to adjudicating between differences, pretty much gives us no hope at all. Okay, it embraces diversity and allowing different cultures to form their own morality. We should be tolerant and respectful of other cultures. Okay, that's a wonderful sentiment, right? But logically speaking, what's the terrible problem with it? So we discussed this earlier, so let me run it by you again. I'm a cultural relativist, so I'm telling you, there are no absolutes. Okay, now, because I'm a relativist, so I think that we should all respect other cultures, allow them to have their own way, be respectful, be tolerant. Okay, what's the terrible logical problem with what I just said?
That's an absolute.
That's an absolute. Right. So it's only the absolutist who's able to say this. Hey, don't be arrogant. Be humble. Respect others who are different than you.
What chapter is this again?
What chapter was this one on? Who did this one? What's that? Chapter 9, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, that if you're saying be tolerant, be respectful, and you're saying that as a universal, you're giving an absolute. But that's exactly the opposite of cultural relativism, because they say there are no absolutes, right? So this is real common, which is why it totally makes sense that you're going to think that way, because it's, again, your education and your cultures totally ground you in this kind of philosophy. But if you think through it logically, you see some glaring problems. Okay, then we went to group 4. There are many theories about what is right and wrong. Who is to say that one morality is better than another? Okay, now, again, this makes sense that, wait a minute, there's a lot of different theories. There's a lot of different cultures saying different things are right or wrong. So there's no hope of adjudicating this. So it must be that there's not a fact of the matter. that there's not a theory which best accounts for morality, right? And that's a totally understandable sentiment. Okay, now what if you applied that attitude, though, to science? Now, I'm not talking about something which it seems, science has proven very well. I'm talking, though, about some new problem that's coming up where it's not so clear, where you have lots of scientists thinking lots of different approaches would be fecund. So do you conclude, well, wait a minute, we have lots of different scientists suggesting different approaches toward curing cancer, so it must be that there's not one. Anybody can accept that? No, probably instead you're going to say, well, maybe somebody has found an approach that is most promising. Well, then why hasn't everyone accepted it? Well, perhaps they haven't heard it. Perhaps they haven't understood it. Perhaps if they accept it, it will get in the way of their getting grants. What do you mean? You're talking about grants in politics regarding science? Are you serious? Yeah, totally. Maybe it offends them because they have a big ego and it shows that the approach that they've been doing for the last 20 years has not been the most fruitful one, and they got a big ego, so they're not going to accept that. What? Scientists are people who also can succumb to egoism? Yep, they're people. Right? So, anyway, there's all kinds of possibilities as to why, if there's one approach that's better than others, it doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be universally accepted, right? Or it could be this. It's really, really complicated, and we have to be like an Edison who comes up, with the attitude that, okay, what I have found is 10,000 filaments that do not work for creating a light bulb. All right, good. I know 10,000 ways that don't work. I'm going to keep trying. Right? So just because I haven't come to success yet, just because we haven't arrived at a consensus yet, isn't at all to say that there's not an answer. So the same thing with morality. Okay, onward. We have different values, so we shouldn't interfere and start conflict. Okay, now again, the idea is that by saying live and let live, or by saying that cultural relativism is true so that we don't have any common ground, would be the way to avoid conflict. Because if we say that somebody else is wrong and we're right, perhaps that means that, hey, that could even escalate to war, could it not? So why don't we just not cause the conflict in saying somebody else is wrong? Okay, can somebody come up with some example in geopolitics right now? Okay, how about what's been in the news just the last, 2 days? Which is really insane. In the real world, but that there can be things going on like this in the real world where it's only by acknowledging the conflict, maybe even engaging it, sometimes to the point of war, right? So at that Texas church shooting, what happened? Well, one guy was in his house nearby, heard all the gunshots, and grabbed his gun, ran to the church, saw the gunman who was plucking people away, and this guy who had his AK-47 engaged with this mass murderer and shot him dead. That's not very nice. That's conflict. That's a gun. Guns are bad. Well, I bet some people who were left standing in the church were probably really happy for that gun at that time anyway. Right? So what I'm saying is that, yes, sometimes if you say that there's a right and a wrong, it's going to mean that you are going to acknowledge genuine conflict. And that it can mean that sometimes you're going to engage in that conflict. Perhaps even with violence, right? You're advocating violence? Yeah, I am. Like when I pulled up in my car at a Meijer and saw this guy punching his girlfriend or wife, whatever she was, punching her face in.
You saw that?
Yes, I did. And so what did I do? Well, I said to myself, I'm a relativist. And I don't want to cause conflict. And who am I to judge? I don't want to say that he's wrong. Right? Because that would be conflicting and not nice. And heck, this could even escalate to violence.
You call 911, right?
I didn't want to engage. Who am I to judge?
Silent observer.
Who am I to judge? Who am I to escalate this into me causing only more conflict? I am a man of peace.
Whoa.
Right? So no, I'm pulling your leg. Okay. Now in this case, it turns out that all I had to do was, turn on my brights on him, stay behind him, lay on the horn, call 911, and that was the end of it. Right? Now, what if it escalated more? Well, anyway, the point is that, yes, if you're going to say that there's right and wrong, it's going to mean that you might witness something that you believe is wrong. And it could mean then that you're going to even escalate the conflict. Maybe even to the point of violence. Because you know what? I wouldn't have felt immoral if that guy would have kept beating on her. Didn't care about my brights, didn't care about the horn, didn't care that I said the cops are on the way and kept beating on her. What am I going to do? Well, that's none of my business. Well, okay, maybe I'm not obligated to have to put myself in danger, but I would have. I would want to have opened his door, pulled his ass out on the ground, and engage. But that's violent. That's conflict. Yeah, it is. No apologies. Of course, I would have probably got my ass kicked because I'm not a very big guy. But it'd be worth a try. Alrighty. Where do we leave off? We can deny cultural relativism while still seeking to understand why cultures hold the values that they do. And that's absolutely true. You see, that could be a moral thing to do. That could be a moral absolute. Hey, before saying that another culture is wrong, make sure you understand why it is that they do what they do. Make sure that you have understanding first. Don't just mouth off and get in their face, right? Make sure you understand the situation. Yes, and saying that itself is a moral absolute. Finally, group 5. We have something called subsidiarity. That means let the smallest body that's capable handle a function. So, subsidiarity. Let the smallest body that can handle it, handle it. So, if it's an individual that's able to handle their own problem, let them handle it. Stay out of their business. Okay, if it's the family that's able to handle the problem with the child, let the family handle it. Stay out of their business if they're able to handle it and they're handling it, right? Okay, and then on the way up, right? What if it's the state that can handle the problem? Doesn't need the federal government coming in. Okay, let the state decide. Of course, I skipped the municipality and the city and all, right? Jumped up to the state. Okay, what about the whole federal government? If it's something the federal government can handle and they didn't need the UN to come in with their laws, Okay, let the country handle their own problems. Let each country handle its problems if they're capable of it, right? So that's the principle of subsidiarity. No capitalist seeks total laissez-faire, meaning capitalism doesn't say, hey, let's make sure we have no government regulation whatsoever. Okay, but on the other side of it, socialists in America typically look to Canada and Scandinavia for examples of their socialism, not to hard communist nations. So let's be fair when we're talking about what you guys were talking about, socialism versus communism, socialism versus capitalism, that you're being fair-minded about what kind of capitalism you're talking about, and you're not setting up a straw man argument as though capitalists are total laissez-faire, right? But then likewise, capitalists, when you're talking about socialists, make sure that you're not, necessarily painting them with a brush of being a hardcore communist when what their ideal is more like Canada or Scandinavia, right? So be fair in how you're defining your opponent. Equality, a big thing here is equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. Do you want equality of outcomes or do you want equality of opportunity? Well, I tell you what I'm going to do in this class, okay? Because you're all a bunch of socialists, right? So what I'm going to do is give you equality of outcome. I'm just kidding, right? But there actually is a teacher, I think it was at Central Michigan University, who literally did this a little past midterm. And he said, is it fair that some of you have nice laptops and others of you don't have any laptop at all? Some of you had parents that made sure you went to school and made sure you went to good schools, and other parents couldn't care less, weren't even home, didn't even know when you got home, didn't care. No, that's not fair. Well, I'm going to make it fair. So right now, I've averaged out all of your grades. And that's the grade every one of you are going to get. Ah! So all of a sudden, socialist students hear that, and pretty well, they're thinking, well, wait a minute. And then they're talking like capitalists. I earned that grade. Okay, maybe I did have a leg up because I had parents that cared and gave me the nice education and all, made sure that I did well. But But I mean, y'all have different backgrounds, right? Some better backgrounds, some worse backgrounds academically. And so, we need socialism here in the classroom to make sure that we have equality of outcome. Okay, then all of a sudden, when you put some skin in the game for real for yourself, you probably have a real problem with it, right? Okay, but probably what you're thinking in that case is, wait a minute, I want equality of opportunity, meaning, hey, you're there to help everybody the best you can, you're fair to everybody, but if some people are starting from a lower rung than others, well, it means they're going to have to put in extra work, but we're not looking for equality of outcome. Typically what equality of outcome means when you do that in a nation is that everybody gets far worse. And then nobody is motivated to compete. In just a minute, let me finish this up real quick. So everyone gets the same grade. Okay, I told that.
Is it a passing grade?
I think it was a D is what it ended up as. But is the pie a zero-sum game or can the pie grow? That's the big analogy here. Typically, when you're talking socialism and you want equality of outcomes, what you're doing is assuming it's a zero-sum game, that you have this fixed pie that you got to slice up and give everybody a piece, right? And that means that if you're going to make it equal, everybody's going to get a tiny little piece. Okay, so the capitalist response to that, otherwise known as the free market person, right, is, wait a minute, that's a bad analogy because actually the pie can grow. So, what has done tremendous good for Africa and China and many, many countries? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like China's more capitalist than we are. We have, in the world, I believe it's the highest capital gains tax at 35% on businesses, as opposed to a lot of other nations that have it down to like 20%. Okay, why does that matter? What does that have to do with this? If you make it such that companies can grow and grow and grow and give them the incentive to do so, means that they're going to be able to hire a lot more people. But if you make it such that they can't, and you keep constraining them, saying, we're going to take more of your wealth and spread the wealth around, what typically happens? Well, it happens like Caterpillar in Illinois. They say, bye, Illinois. We're going to a southern state where we're not so restricted. And so they take their whole company to a southern state, and then they employ a bunch of people down there who are like, wow, maybe it's not as much as I'd really like to earn, but gee, it sure is nice to have a job again. All right, you guys have a good week.